Thank you. I'm Stephen Overy from Newcastle University, just in case anyone I haven't spoken to yet, and I'll be chairing this panel. I'm not going to say much at the beginning. I'm just going to say thank you to the organisers, Tade and Lorenzo, and to SAZU. It's been a wonderful event so far, and I'm sure the next couple of days are going to be wonderful. This panel is going to be the philosophy panel, and we've got 3 exciting papers, I think, about 3 different philosophers. Just to lighten the mood beforehand, I thought I'd go for a quick joke before we begin. And I didn't know a Nietzsche, Blanchot, and Kierkegaard joke, so I asked ChatGPT to write me one. So here we go. Hopefully no one laughs, because this isn't particularly funny. Nietzsche, Blanchot, and Kierkegaard find themselves inexplicably tearing a sewer. Nietzsche looks around and declares, if you gaze long enough into the abyss will gaze back into you. Enjoying the silence. Blanchot nods thoughtfully, adding, and this is a bit gross, here the outside and inside converge, perfect for contemplation. Kierkegaard, stepping carefully over a puddle, remarks, the sewer is truly the place for existential reflection. It's where one must confront the depths. And then Nietzsche chuckles and says, or at least watch where you step. So there we go, a nice mood lightener. So first speaker, Henrik Jøker Bjerre, is an associate professor of applied philosophy at Aalborg University in Denmark, the author of Kantian Deeds and a number of articles and chapters on Kierkegaard in relation to authorship and otherness.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for the invitation and for organizing the event. I'm really greatly honored to be part of this. I will go immediately to my text to not spend too much time. The title of my text is The Ventriloquist, Kierkegaard's Extimate Voices. So, in a first and last explanation, a short text, Kierkegaard writes that if it should occur to anyone to want to quote a particular passage from his pseudonymous work, he would prefer them to refer to the pseudonym in question rather than to Kierkegaard himself. The short text is an appendix to the appendix that the author of the rather voluminous concluding unscientific postscript, Johannes Climacus, has added himself. Writing in his own name, Kierkegaard takes responsibility for the major pseudonymous works from his intensely productive period from 1842 to 1846, but then adds that in this work he considers himself to be an author of authors rather than an author of content. Quote, my relation is even more remote than that of a poet who poetizes characters and yet in the preface is himself the author. That is, I am impersonally or personally in the third person a souffleur, a prompter, who has poetically produced the authors, whose prefaces in turn are their productions as their names are also, unquote. Several things are of interest in this passage. First, the formulation about being even more remote than a poet emphasizes the very particular nature of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous writings. They are not traditional academic scholarship because they are clearly fictionalized, written by pseudonymous authors in particular life situations. But they are not novels either. Kierkegaard precisely created authors rather than characters, and the main effort of his writing is not to make them experience various things or events, but to make them speak. He has produced the authors, but they have produced everything else, even their own names, which is in and of itself a striking image. One possible interpretation being that each pseudonym's name was dictated by its relevance to the work that it was writing, rather than by some whimsical intuition of Kierkegaard himself. Quote, my pseudonymity or polynymity has not had an accidental basis in my person, but an essential basis in the production itself, unquote. The author of Repetition, for example, is called Constantine Constantius, a name which has the book's core problematic inscribed into it. The last name is a repetition of the first name with a slight deviation. And the name of the author of the concept of anxiety, Vigilius Haufniensis, the vigilant Copenhagener, arguably indicates that he is well suited to performing the simple psychologically orienting deliberation on the topic of anxiety and sin, like the book's subtitle promises. In his preface, Hauffniensis even remarks that he would be ready to take on a much simpler and humbler name like Christen Massen if his Latin name should offend anyone. Secondly, there is the image of the prompter, which is worth examining at some length, because it gives a slightly different picture of the relation between Kierkegaard, his authors, and their work than what I want to elaborate with the metaphor of the ventriloquist. The prompter appears as an arguably rather casual image to emphasize that Kierkegaard considers himself to be something like an assistant to the pseudonymous authors rather than the author of their work. Since the metaphor appears in such a central passage, however, I want to explain a bit more carefully why I prefer the one of the ventriloquist instead. This explanation is all the more relevant, I would say, because Kierkegaard actually does comment on the figure of the ventriloquist in a couple of entries. For example, criticizing the contemporary 19th century tendency to neglect the question of subjectivity and personality and instead operate with a, quote, fantastically pure I and its ventriloquy, unquote. The prompter does have some important similarities with the ventriloquist. In both cases, there is an act involved which furthers the illusion of a character speaking its own mind, although the content of the speech comes from elsewhere. Both supply words to the supposedly speaking agent, and like the ventriloquist is supposed not to move her lips, the prompter is supposed to lend her support without being detected. But there are certainly differences between the two as well. While the prompter remains out of sight and keeps her voice inaudible to everyone but the actor, the ventriloquist is very much part of the act and speaks loudly and clearly, even in two voices, her own and the voice of the dummy. On a first glance, something does speak for the prompter in this comparison. It seems more consistent with Kierkegaard's ambition of erasing the importance of his own views and contributions to the thoughts of the characters. Like the prompter, he steps back and lets the characters speak for themselves. Nonetheless, there are also significant weaknesses in the metaphor of the prompter. In one sense, it is precisely too clean, if you will, as if Kierkegaard has nothing to do with the actual writing, but only neutrally refreshed the memory of the pseudonymous authors whenever they lost their track. First of all, the metaphor therefore leads to absurdities. Strictly speaking, the logical consequence would be that there was a fully completed manuscript available to the pseudonyms written by someone other than themselves and Kierkegaard, which they had learned by heart and would recite with Kierkegaard's help. In other words, if Kierkegaard was the prompter, then the authors wouldn't be authors at all. This could, of course, be explained by some additional theory of another unknown source behind the manuscript, divine or otherwise, but that doesn't seem to be what Kierkegaard wants to say here. Rather, he precisely wants to emphasize the work of being of the pseudonymous authors. Second of all, absurdities aside, the metaphor of the prompter in any case exaggerates the distance between Kierkegaard and his writing. At least since precisely the addendum to the concluding unscientific postscript, the name Kierkegaard has been unavoidably connected to the work that he takes responsibility for. Indeed, the very existence of a first and last explanation from 1846 has precisely that effect. Kierkegaard literally attaches himself to the works written by his pseudonyms. It would certainly be naive to simply assume the contents of these works to be the expressions of the thoughts and opinions of the biographical person Søren Kierkegaard, as much commentary unfortunately still does. But pretending that the works had no relation to him at all would require an equally naive and unnecessarily awkward gesture. He was the one holding the pen, and even if one disregards any importance of the biographical figure of the author, the name Kierkegaard undeniably stands for some agent behind the enterprise with some relation to the writing. Kierkegaard makes his authors speak. He is producing the authors, as it says in the quoted passage above, and this production, of course, takes place in the process of writing up their voices. Therefore, what is at stake in the pseudonymous work is always a delicate relation between Kierkegaard, or the name Kierkegaard, and the protagonists of the work at hand, and Kierkegaard is always present, even if in no other way than in the capacity of the one who is not speaking. So I would like to sketch sort of three different ways this structure of ventriloquism is taking place in different works of Kierkegaard. First, author of authors. What does it mean? Let me make a quick reference to Fear and Trembling to make my point clearer. The author of Fear and Trembling is named Johannes de Silentio, a name that, like Constantine Constantius and Vigilius Hauffniensis, fits well to the task at hand. In this case, to express the silent awe at Abraham's inscrutable faith as it occurs from the story about the traumatic demand of the sacrifice of Isaac in the Old Testament. Abraham's faith is impossible to conceive, let alone describe in straightforward terms, because it implies that he in fact sets out to adhere to the mysterious demand to sacrifice his only son, and is yet deeply convinced that everything will turn out all right. How can you accept such a gruesome command and remain optimistic? The story is so outrageous that any reading of it that does not condemn its cruelty runs the risk of being condemned itself. Fear and Trembling, nonetheless, does not condemn the story's cruelty, because its endeavor is not to judge or to affirm already known principles of right and wrong that could then be applied to Abraham, but to investigate the particular and peculiar dimension of faith. Its approach is curious. How is it possible to believe in the face of such overwhelming meaninglessness? Kierkegaard makes De Silentio speak reluctantly about his inability to follow Abraham, to understand him, let alone explain or justify his action. If there is a fundamentalist brutality in Fear and Trembling, it is actually and carefully thrice removed from Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard has created an author who interprets the Old Testament and who is unable to understand what drives Abraham. And even on De Silentio's interpretation, furthermore, Abraham himself is unable to understand what drives him. He is unable to speak and therefore remains silent on the entire journey to the mountain. Indeed, it could even be argued that there is a fourth level of distance in Fear and Trembling. After the preface and before the narration of the book itself begins, there appears an enigmatic interlude with no apparent author at all. It is entitled Exordium, Stemning in Danish, and it opens with the well-known fairy tale anonymizer, Once Upon a Time. The interlude describes a man who was so occupied by the story of Abraham that it started dominating his world of imagination entirely. He walked the heavy walk with Abraham endless times in his thoughts, and he tried again and again from different angles to approach the goal of understanding how Abraham could think and feel like he did. The interlude, in other words, seems to describe De Silentio himself, but is it then written by someone else who steps in and describes him in a third-person perspective? Or is it in fact written by De Silentio, either describing someone else to illustrate how one can be obsessed by this story, or describing himself from the outside, as if giving a kind of meta-narrative of what has made him endeavor to write the book? The text does not give any definite answer to these questions, and as Jakob Bøgild has formulated it, quote, a conflict between the narration and its object has already been established, unquote. So the author of authors, the first part, already complicated. Second version, dummies with dummies. The mysterious third author in Fear and Trembling indicates another trend in Kierkegaard's writing. On quite a few occasions, the relation between Kierkegaard and the pseudonyms, or the pseudonymous author of a text, includes the primary author's own elaboration of the question about the authorship. This ranges from the more enigmatic relation between De Silentio and the author, as well as the protagonist of the exordium from Fear and Trembling, to explicit staging of Chinese puzzles where the dummy itself engages in ventriloquism. In Repetition, for example, the author, Constantine Constantius, towards the end of the book, suddenly reveals that everything in the story about the young man he had given counsel was something that he had made up entirely on his own. The letters allegedly written by the young man to Constantine turn out to be letters actually authored by Constantine himself. He invented the young man because he needed his poetic soul to complement the more rigorous and less passionate tendency in his own thought. Quote, the young man I have brought into being is a poet. I can do no more, for the most I can do is to imagine a poet and to produce him by my thought. I myself cannot become a poet, and in any case my interest lies elsewhere, unquote. The ventriloquism is thus expanded from Kierkegaard giving voice to his author to a situation in which this author himself turns out to be a ventriloquist. The dummy is speaking through its own dummy, as it were, creating a kind of reduplication of itself in order to engage with the dimension of its own thought which contradicts its own immediate being. Constantine, in fact, explicitly admits to having functioned as a ventriloquist when lending voice to the young man's woes, resembling contemporary stage performances of ventriloquism, even to the extent that his own statements could be considered as cues to the dummy. Quote, "Every move I have made is merely to throw light on him. I have had him constantly in mente, in mind. Every word of mine is either ventriloquism or is said in connection with him." Unquote. Another example with an even more complicated structure, Either Or, is published by Victor Eremita, who has also written the preface, in which he explains how he discovered the manuscript in an old antique writing desk that he had purchased in a shop. Here he found two sets of papers, one with a clear center and one without. The unsigned bunch contained a number of disparate fragments, articles and essays on themes broadly related to what Kierkegaard describes as aesthetics, while the letters signed by Wilhelm were well-ordered and upbuilding essays addressed to a friend. So there are two authors, A and B, as Eremita calls them, the first being also the addressee of B's letters. This seems to be a relatively clear structure. A himself, however, the aesthetic person, claims not to have written one of the longer texts in the aesthetic papers. In fact, A claims to have found the seducer's diary in a way that is strikingly similar to what Eremita had claimed to be the origin of all the manuscripts in general. It somehow unexpectedly turned up in a writing desk. Unlike Eremita's story, the desk in question is not one that A took hold of, but merely one that he seems to have passed by on a number of occasions. He must have known the owner because he claims that the drawers of the desk would usually be locked, but that this was not the case on the day when he found the manuscript. It is not at all clear who A believes to have been the author, but it is clear enough that A denies authorship of the diary. Eremita, however, is not convinced by this story and finds it much more plausible that A wrote the diary himself, but wanted to distance himself from the contents, and therefore invented the not entirely convincing story of having suddenly passed by an open drawer with a ready manuscript. In his own preface to Either Or, Eremita remarks, quote, "A does not declare himself the author, but only the editor. This is an old literary device to which I would not have much to object if it did not further complicate my own position, since one author becomes enclosed within the other like the boxes in a Chinese puzzle. This is not the place to explain in greater detail what confirms me in my view. I shall only point out that the prevailing mood in A's preface somehow manifests the poet," unquote. In other words, Eremita raises doubt about the authenticity of A's claim that someone else was the author of the diary, and instead alleges that it must have been written by A himself. The style and literary device of the preface to the seducer's diary, allegedly reveal as much. Translated to the terms of ventriloquism, Eremita is saying to the ventriloquist A that his lips moved. But that is not all. The similarity to Eremita's own story in turn implies that a similar doubt could be raised about his authorship. If the critique applies to A, it's an old trick, then why not also to Eremita himself? He does precisely the same when claiming to have found the manuscript in their entirety in an old desk. So is it really Eremita himself who has written all the manuscripts in the book? Since Eremita does not address the obvious similarity between the two cover stories, however, the suspicion could be followed even further. Is Eremita somehow strangely unaware of the telling similarity between the two cover stories? Or is he, on the contrary, keenly aware of it, and by pointing out A's story, indirectly criticizing the very setup of the book as such, maybe even hinting at his own role as a literary device? Although this, of course, seems psychologically implausible for a real person to do, does it not resemble the kind of self-reflective, ironic discourse that a dummy might entertain in a ventriloquist act? In other words, isn't Eremita the dummy effectively saying to Kierkegaard himself that his lips moved? In any case, we again have an intricate triple relation between artist, dummy, and dummy's dummy, in which the act includes hints and more or less explicit exclamations that the three are more intimately connected than might immediately occur. And then the third version, which is quite a different relation, which appears in writings that Kierkegaard himself has signed as the author, with Kierkegaard himself as the dummy. Finally, there are cases in Kierkegaard's authorship in which the relation seems to be turned around and Kierkegaard himself is functioning as the dummy. More precisely, instead of staying in the imagery of contemporary ventriloquist performances, one should probably compare these cases to the ancient forms of ventriloquism, in which the ventriloquist is the medium rather than the author of the voice. In the preface to From the Papers of One Still Living, which is Kierkegaard's first published book, which is really a review of a short story by Hans Christian Andersen, which is a very critical review of Andersen, published in 1838. In the preface to this book, a strange and seemingly unnecessary redoubling of the authorship is introduced from the very first sentence, in which Kierkegaard, who has, like I said, signed, he's the author officially, in which Kierkegaard attributes the content of the essay that follows to a doppelganger, whom he refers to as the actual author, while describing himself as, quote, the medium through which he telegraphs with the world, unquote. The actual author does not have a name, nor scarcely an existence, except from his function as a redoubling or a counterpoint to the one holding the pen. But this very function precisely establishes Kierkegaard himself as a ventriloquist in the sense that resembles the structure of the ancient oracles. Something is being transmitted through him from a source that is not completely clear, and he can do nothing else but stand by his responsibility for communicating this content to a broader public. From the point of view of the writer, in other words, the wording of his writing comes from somewhere else. It's delivered to him as if spoken from some place beyond his own conscious mind. He just inscribes it on the paper. In my point of view, for my work as an author, which was posthumously published in 1859, Kierkegaard describes his inability. This is my other example of Kierkegaard himself as the dummy. Kierkegaard describes his inability to express the implications of his own religious turn, as it might be described, towards the end of the authorship, or what I would call the third period of the authorship. Quote, when it was a matter of boldness, enthusiasm, zeal, almost to the border of madness, what was this pen not able to present, unquote. But when it comes to the gratitude of receiving the bliss of love or the wonder of what, quote, a human being's weakness is capable of with his, God's help, unquote, words fail him. If he could only find the expression that would appropriately describe God's love, he would gladly die with this expression on his lips. Quote, but then when I pick up my pen, for a time I cannot, just as one speaks of not being able to move a foot, move my pen. In that state, not a line about this relationship is put down on paper. I seem to hear a voice that says to me, obtuse fellow, what does he think he is? Does he not know that obedience is dearer to God than the fat of rams? Do the whole thing as a work assignment. Then I can do it. Then I dare not do anything else. Then I write each word, each line, almost unaware of the next word and the next line, unquote. Almost unaware, in Danish, it's called, he writes, så godt som uvidende, which literally means as good as ignorant of the next word and the next line. When the writer lets go of his own fanciful expectations of being able to provide excellent offerings for the praise of God, he is finally able to express what he needs to express. He holds the pen and lets go, and then he writes, as good as ignorant of the next word that is about to come. Maybe God is the name of the subject's ability to express thoughts that it did not know that it had. So, and then the last section with a little bit more sort of literary or philosophical explanation about what I then will call his extimate voices. In a famous note in his journal from 1843, Kierkegaard writes about his nachlass, that after his death no one shall quote, find even one piece of information about what actually filled my life, find the writing in my innermost, which explains everything, unquote. He intends, namely, he says, to remove, quote unquote, the secret note which would have explained. This remark about the secret note has caused a lot of debate as to its possible existence. Even a crime novel, there's a Danish crime novel which is entitled Den hemmelige note, the secret note. But I rather like the laconic comment from the publishers in the complete edition that merely states that, quote, it cannot be determined whether Søren Kierkegaard is hinting at an actual or fictional act, unquote, when talking about removing the secret note. Isn't this in a way indicative of his authorship as such? It cannot be determined whether it is actual or fictional. That is, it would be mistaken to consider everything Kierkegaard wrote to be unproblematically his own words or actual statements of his philosophical position. But it would be just as wrong to dismiss the relevance of the point of his authorship on the basis of assuming everything to be fictional. More precisely, Kierkegaard's voice, or the voice that is articulated in his writings, could be called an extimate diegetic voice. This is a concept which has been defined by Ida Nissen-Bjerre by short-circuiting Gerard Genet's concept of intra- and extra-diegetic voices. So Genet has a lot of different versions of diegesis, intra and extra, and homodiegetic, heterodiegetic, metadiegetic, but so I'll try to just make a very simple point out of the relation between intradiegetic voices, which are voices internal to the world of the narration itself, and extradiegetic voices that are speaking about the narration or the world, or somehow intervening in it maybe, but from the outside. For example, in a preface that describes what's going on in the text that follows, or this all-knowing author which describes the world of the protagonists from above or from the outside. So that's Genet's concepts, intra- and extra-diegetic voices, and then Ida Nissen is combining this to create sort of the new concept of an extimate diegetic voice. This extimate diegetic voice is neither completely external to the point of view of the narrator of the text, nor completely internal. It comes from an extimate source, that is a source that is intimate and from the outside at the same time. Or it comes, with Lacan's own words, for he is of course the originator of the term extimate, from, quote from Seminar 7, from an other whose primacy of position Freud affirms in the form of something entfremdet, something strange to me, although it is at the heart of me, unquote. In either or, for example, Victor Eremita's preface could seem to be extra-diegetical in the sense that it is external to the world of the narrators of the book, of the books, you could say, however many they, the authors, may be. His explanation of how he found the manuscript is highly contingent from the point of view of A and B and the stories they are telling. Nonetheless, Eremita does consider himself part of the same world as A and B. For example, he has been careful to make sure that nothing is disclosed about their true identity. He also arguably plays a tacit role in the texts themselves after having introduced them. Eremita is in a way a hidden other in the manuscripts, listening to the stories from his position as publisher. He states, for example, from the beginning that his theoretical interest in the manuscripts is to confirm his thesis that the inner and the outer do not converge, that is, that things are not necessarily what they present themselves to be. A and B themselves, on the other hand, would seem to be intradiegetical to each other's stories, in as far as B is writing letters to A and claiming to know him rather well. But can we be completely sure that A would recognize B as part of the same world as himself? Even more to the point, who is in fact the author of the seducer's diary? And what does it mean that Eremita does not seem to notice the similarity between A's story about the manuscript to the diary and his own story about the entire collection? Such questions open the dimension of the extimate diegetic. And if we allow ourselves a more intertextual interpretation, doesn't the publication of Fear and Trembling in the same year as Either Or suggest that something was not enough in the entire construction of B's ethical universe? What does it mean for the understanding of the very talkative Judge Wilhelm B that he is introduced by a publisher, eremita, that likes to listen to incongruences and congruences in people's talk, and succeeded by Johannes de Silentio, who quietly seeks to but cannot understand Abraham's faith? So there's in a way, silent listener who is introducing eremita, and then there's a silent author, explicitly silent afterwards. Almost as if they're saying to Wilhelm, you seem to talk a lot. In the pseudonymous works, it seems to me, Kierkegaard is examining voices that owe their existence to an external source and are never in complete control with what they're saying. So just as much as he's presenting their perspective or their idea, to invoke Bakhtin's definition of the polyphonic novel, he is presenting what Bjerre calls, quote, the remainder of the I narration, that is, its leftover or opacity. So that's a little bit convoluted, but Bakhtin famously in his book on the poetics in Dostoevsky distinguishes between monological and polyphonic novels, and he praises Dostoevsky for having invented sort of the polyphonic novel in which each character has its own idea and is represented as its own voice instead of being directed or controlled by the narrator like in Tolstoy's stories. And there's something about this that also could be said about Kierkegaard, that he has individual authors and characters who have their own voices, but there's always something more, something else, which is what we could call the remainder of the I narration, its leftover or opacity, its obliqueness, and the questions that I have been trying to raise in relation to the authorship itself. In those cases, when Kierkegaard is acting like the dummy himself, that is when he explicitly writes on the impulse from something else, something other, be it the real author, like in the very early piece, or the divine command to hold the pen and write, the extimacy of the author's voice is, of course, more obvious than in the pseudonymous writings. But still, I think the case is comparable. Holding the pen in the case of Kierkegaard himself being the dummy, in these cases, does not imply that one knows what it will produce, almost on the contrary. What remains in either case is the intricate relation to the other, or to an other, which is something like the fundamental issue of Kierkegaard's thinking, I would claim, or as it was formulated by Anticlimacus in Sickness unto Death, a self is, quote, a derived, established relation, a relation that relates itself to itself, and in relating itself to itself, relates itself to an other, unquote. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Henrik. That was brilliant. I have one quick question, and then we'll move on. So I was thinking about the sort of bestiary of intermediators that you might have set up here. You've got the ventriloquist and you've got the prompter, but there might have been other things we could have think about here, an archivist, an eavesdropper, a ghost writer, something else like that. And I can see one of the things that you liked about the ventriloquist was this kind of activity and passivity, being the dummy and then not being the dummy. Mm-hmm. Also, sort of ventriloquism is a kind of live process and people can see it happening, and the dummy kind of speaks for itself a bit more in some ways. But there's a big difference as well, which is that the ventriloquism is speech rather than writing, and these Kierkegaard texts are still written texts. So I was wondering really why it is that you were attracted to the idea of the ventriloquist with its sort of inherent contradiction between speech and writing, and if there were any other different sort of descriptions you were playing with when you were writing it and thinking about, is there a different way to describe it rather than ventriloquism?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And it relates to one of the issues I've had dealing with this. I mean, I didn't mention Mladen in my text, but I'm obviously very inspired by Mladen's work on the voice. And if you want to use sort of Mladen's or Lacan's, I think, also thinking of the voice to analyze literary texts, you need to make this kind of considerations exactly. How do you translate the idea of, or the concept of a voice as a spoken voice to the situation in the staging of a literary authorship? And so, I mean, I have another text chapter about this question, but well, first of all, what I'm doing here is that Kierkegaard himself is using such an example. The prompter is exactly someone who is lending their voice to an actor who is forgetting their lines, literally. So it's a metaphor that's translated into his literary production. So that's why I think that's a plausible metaphor, but it doesn't fit exactly to his own work. And then second, I mean, I would also, I mean, have liked to say more about the whole idea of ventriloquism and especially the modern and contemporary forms of sort of popular stage performances, where there's something in the very structure of the relation between the ventriloquist and the puppet or the dummy that I think is, like I've tried to express, very much applicable to Kierkegaard's way of doing philosophy. And one of the things, I'm not sure if I can explain it or if I'm really precise about this, but I think there's an important point in how ventriloquism itself actually works in stage performances, that the illusion that is created is actually not the illusion that the puppet or the dummy is speaking by itself, but the illusion is precisely that the ventriloquist is making the puppet speak. So we know very well, of course, that the puppet cannot speak by itself, but strangely somehow we are allowed to pretend that we actually believe that the ventriloquist is making it speak nonetheless. So there's a whole structure of how the voice is introduced or coming from the outside and making the dummy speak, which we can accept because in a way and that is what, for example, Martin is writing about our voice, is that there's like Zizek also writes about that, there's a ventriloquism related to the whole idea of speaking as such. It's as if the voice is coming from some strange source that is, outside and inside at the same time. And this structure, I think, is what precisely relates well to Kierkegaard, with the caveat that there's a certain explanation of how the relation between speech and writing should be figured out. But I think this is exactly what Kierkegaard is doing. That's why also I'm emphasizing in the text that he's making his authors speak. And that's his ventriloquist performance, that he's making them speak, and he's there with them on the stage, so to say, and speaking sometimes in the preface with his own name even.
Thank you very much. We'll have more time for general questions at the end with the whole panel. So, thank you. So our next presenter, Aleš Bunta, is a research associate at the Research Centre of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts, Institute of Philosophy, Ljubljana, Slovenia, and a lecturer at the postgraduate school. He's author of numerous articles and 4 books in Slovenian: To Annihilate Nothing, The Magnetism of Stupidity, A Cogito, and Nietzsche and the Ineffable Thought.
Thank you for this very kind introduction, and also thank you very much for inviting me here to tolerate this also kind of a different, more traditionally philosophical approach. But in this case, I will try to kind of reach out in a certain way. My lecture is entitled The Paradox of Nietzsche's Knowledge. Within the Vienna psychoanalytic circle, very early on, the question of the so-called paradox of Nietzsche's knowledge arose. How is it possible that Nietzsche anticipated some of the important insights of psychoanalysis if he did not have at his disposal either clinical experience or all the procedures and methods that make up psychoanalytic science? To answer this question, the pioneers of psychoanalysis had to resort to explanations such as unrepeatable level of self-observation or monstrous intuition, which clearly imply concepts that not only psychoanalysis was reluctant to embrace, but Nietzsche himself was deeply suspicious of. The fact that Freud could not explain the affinities with Nietzsche except by proclaiming him genius of approaches neither of them believed in is merely one of the indications that psychological dimension of Nietzsche's philosophy was a source of unease in psychoanalysis from the very beginning. Of course, I cannot go into all of them here. I can only refer to Assun's most thorough study, but this certainly includes both Freud's almost systematic silence on Nietzsche, even at the point when he was facing a quasi-Nietzschean rebellion in his own ranks, as well as his claim to have sparse knowledge of Nietzsche's work, despite his awareness that it was indeed somehow complementary to his own. Right away, I would like to dispel a possible misunderstanding. I'm not claiming that the similarities with Nietzsche provoked in Freud a doubt in originality of psychoanalytic insights, nor am I pointing that they should have. But it does appear to me that Nietzsche represented for Freud a knowledge whose origin he could not explain, a knowledge which, insofar as it was mostly derived from pure speculation, a terrain which Freud aspired to avoid at all cost, possibly should not have existed at all, according to Freud, but which, in some annoying way, was legitimated time and again by Freud's own scientific discoveries. This much I find certain. Nietzsche more consistently and in more unambiguous, clearer terms than anyone before him deconstructed the old model of the psyche, which was determined by the concepts of consciousness, will, and thinking, and replaced it with a new model that places at the center of psychological inquiry the concept of unconscious instincts or drives. Nietzsche still used these two terms more or less interchangeably. Nietzsche's drive model is, on the one hand, like Freud's, suited to the body, while on the other hand, it relies on adapting the evolutionary theory to psychology. The key link between the bodily element and the microevolutionary element is the notion of embodied error, which, however, also involves an interpretation of the origins of language, as well as a speculation on the original instinctive nature of what we are accustomed to name thinking. The notion of embodied error, which thus emerges as the synthesis of the interpretations of the body, evolution, language, and thought, is therefore, at least in abstract sense, the key to Nietzsche's psychology. Especially so, since Nietzsche actually used the concept of embodied error as one way of defining drive. Already this essential, if at first sight paradoxical, equation between drive and embodied error, which has, I believe, no counterpart in Freud, clearly shows that Nietzsche's drive model differs significantly from Freud's, and this is obviously not the only crucial divergence. Overall, of course, this is not about trying to proclaim Nietzsche as the discoverer of the Freudian unconscious avant la lettre. Nonetheless, we cannot avoid a certain collision, which is primarily of a topological and terminological nature. For I recently came across the observation in otherwise excellent study on Freud-Nietzsche by Sebastian Gardner that Nietzsche, from a strictly Freudian point of view, was, I quote, confounding the preconscious, which is merely descriptively unconscious, with the dynamic unconscious, end of quote. In short, everything that Nietzsche describes as unconscious would supposedly, according to Freudian criteria, fall into somewhat less eminent category of the preconscious. Now, I confess that I do not have enough knowledge to follow this thesis in all its details into the depths of the Freudian field, but I do not really necessitate this knowledge either to prove my point, because the thesis is, I believe, contradictory at the very level of expression. Namely, Nietzsche could not have confounded the unconscious with the preconscious, because for Nietzsche the very boundary between the conscious and the unconscious rounds down the middle of consciousness itself, and is, in fact, inscribed in the very nature of each and every conscious thought. In other words, Nietzsche's unconscious, whatever that might mean, and it certainly doesn't mean precisely the same as in Freud, cannot fall into the preconscious, because the key operations on which Nietzsche bases this notion take place within consciousness and in parallel with the processes of conscious thinking. It cannot be labeled pre or sub, for that matter, because it stands within and disappears alongside. As a descriptive example, we can take one of the very few material ties through which Freud himself, if only in a terminological sense, placed psychoanalysis in continuity with Nietzsche. As you well know, this connection refers to the key psychoanalytic notion of the id. Namely, Freud felt obliged to remind his colleagues that the notion of the id had first been introduced into theoretical use by Nietzsche. The text of this famous introduction, found in Beyond Good and Evil, reads as follows, I quote, "As concerns the superstition of the logicians, I will never tire of emphasizing one short, sweet fact which is not gladly conceded by these superstitious people. Namely, that thought comes when it wants, and not when I want. So that it is a falsification of the facts to say the subject I is the condition of the predicate think. It thinks, but that this it is precisely that old famous ego, is only an assumption, an assertion, to put it mildly." End of quote. Of course, Nietzsche's use of this as dinkt is not necessarily entirely consistent with Freud's id. For Nietzsche, it is undoubtedly more a matter of articulating the destitution of the ego than of permanently naming what actually thinks behind the ego. This, as Gardner has well pointed out, is in a sense proved by the very continuation of the texts, which reads, "In fact, too much is already claimed with this it thinks. Even this it contains an interpretation of the process and doesn't belong to the process itself. Here the concluding is done according to grammatical habit. Namely, thinking is an activity, to every activity belongs something that is active, therefore." End of quote. Both facts, the fact that Nietzsche primarily aims at an articulation of the destitution of the ego, as well as the fact that he also dissolves the S itself in the continuation of the same passage, are obviously important. The latter, I believe, will give the Lacanians an opportunity to demonstrate their dedication to the notion of the subject, but from the point of view of our basic question, that is, from the point of view of the search for the foundation of Nietzsche's psychological insights which puzzled Freud, the first fact appears particularly illuminating, since it points to a kind of primacy, so to speak, of the negative deviation of truth over the aspiration for objective knowledge in Nietzsche. In any case, the passage makes it clear that, at least strictly topologically speaking, what Nietzsche calls the unconscious cannot be reduced to some background pressure that does not penetrate consciousness or to some pre-existing structure that consciousness merely inhabits, as the notion of subconscious might roughly imply. Even though Nietzsche says that even this it contains an interpretation and therefore erases the name, this does not necessarily mean that he also erases the topos itself of what keeps thinking from within my thoughts, while having to remain unnameable to avoid the trap of substantialization that for Nietzsche unavoidably accompanies language. The relationship between consciousness and what we will thus still cautiously call Nietzsche's unconscious can be described by the notion of double transubstantiation of consciousness. The basic effect of this concept, which contains an echo of Deleuze's interpretation, is to show that consciousness in Nietzsche cannot in any way be conceived of as a kind of layer, however thin, sitting on top of the unconscious. Rather, we might even say that consciousness primarily belongs to the subsoil of the unconscious. In Nietzsche, conscious thought can be described as attached to the unconscious in two ways. Not only is each individual thought determined by the action of subconscious instincts and a multitude of affects that are, as he occasionally writes, too fast for consciousness to register, but our thinking with each new occurrence of thought also reiterates One might even say revives, sets in motion the structure of embodied errors. And in fact, it is in this maintenance of embodied errors that, according to Nietzsche, at least from the viewpoint of developmental genesis, the primary task of thinking consists. That parallel to this activation of the maintenance works on the embodied errors, we also happen to be consciously thinking of something is merely a secondary derivation and a byproduct. So what is an embodied error? In the simplest terms, embodied errors, and to emphasize this again, embodied error means for Nietzsche originally the same as drive, are those vital illusions or projections which in the course of hundreds of millennia of the microevolution of the human species and its animal predecessors have proven to be necessary preconditions of the species' survival or prosperity. As a result, what according to Nietzsche is quite wrongly called the cognitive apparatus, in reality this must be first and foremost perceived as a kind of network of organs of life, has had to adapt to them by incorporating them as primary coordinates of our perception and understanding. Everything is therefore, in a fundamental sense, seen, felt, and understood through the prism of these evolutionarily inherited instinctive vital errors. I quote, "The intellect has produced nothing but errors for tremendous stretches of time. Some of them turned out to be useful and species-preserving. Whoever has bumped into them or acquired them through heredity fought his struggle for himself and his progeny with greater success. Such erroneous articles of faith, which were repeatedly inherited and finally became almost the basic constitution of the human species, include, for example, that there are enduring things, that there are equal things, that there are things, substances, bodies, that a thing is what it appears to be, that our willing is free, that what is good for me is also good in and for itself. Only very late did the deniers and doubters of such propositions appear. Only very late did truth appear as the least strongest form of knowledge. It seemed as though we were unable to live with it. Our organism was attuned to its opposite. All of its higher function, the perception of senses and every kind of sensation generally worked with those ancient embodied basic errors." End of quote. The quoted passage from the Joyful Science has only one shortcoming. It omits the central example of an embodied error, which for Nietzsche is the notion of the ego. Nietzsche is thus saying that in addition to the embodied errors to which the organisms adapted evolutionarily, and which were, so to say, imprinted onto the very matrix of our perception and thinking, truth did emerge eventually. From a certain point onwards also arose, one might say, a kind of increasing counterintuitive awareness that the ego, the object, the existent entities, the substances, the free will, etc., are in fact just vital projections which have proved necessary for the survival of the species. However, this awareness remains merely negative, precisely because every act of thought we make, including the one that supposedly dispels these illusions, insofar as it remains embedded in language as the structure of our thinking, immediately reinstates the embodied errors. And in this, we must also observe an instinctive safeguard that sustains the existing edifice of our conscious apprehension. Namely, no less important for Nietzsche than the epistemological deadlock itself that the embodied errors caused by their pertaining to the very structure of our thinking is the opposite, let's say vitalist perspective, from which their smooth functioning and sustainment are considered as natural preconditions of life. From this opposite perspective, the fact that truth has emerged in spite of everything and begun revealing and thus undermining the embodied errors appeared to Nietzsche as a potential sign of imminent collapse of the instinctual order he perceived as naturally organized alongside them. Hence his rather surprising conviction that humanity may soon be faced with the seemingly impossible, colossal task of having to comprehensively reprogram the subconscious economy of human instincts, which in the future will have to adapt to a life with truth. The very truth that, according to Nietzsche, has up to now always proved detrimental to life. Clearly, the idea of such an undertaking would have appeared bizarre, to say the least, to Freud. Nonetheless, it is important to note that Nietzsche, unlike Freud, believed that he was attempting to capture in his lens the picture of the psyche at the moment he considered it undergoing a necessary and fundamental transformation. In fact, it is quite plausible that Nietzsche believed that it was this very ongoing transformation of the psyche that also made it possible touching upon its layers that were previously sealed off by the perfect functioning of the drives, insofar as the concept of drive, defined as an embodied error, implies a full success of a self-deceptive endeavor. But let us take a step back. The primary material ground of embodied errors consists for Nietzsche undoubtedly in language. Indeed, there is a similarity between Freud's conception of dreams and Nietzsche's interpretation of language. If Freud thought that the dreams connect us with primordial periods, then according to Nietzsche, we could say that language keeps us caught in ancient past. I quote The Twilight of Idols this time. In its origin, language belongs to the age of the most rudimentary psychology. We enter a realm of crude fetishism when we summon before consciousness the basic presuppositions of the metaphysics of language. In plain talk, the presuppositions of reason. Everywhere reason sees a doer and doing. It believes in will as the cause. It believes in the ego as being, in the ego as substance. And it projects this faith in the ego substance upon all things. Only thereby does it first create the concept of thing. Everywhere being is projected by thought, pushed underneath as the cause. The concept of being follows and is a derivative of the concept of ego. End of quote. By now, it has been repeated time and again that language is arguably the only sphere of our existence that has not been touched in any major sense by any of the scientific revolutions. Of course, there have been revolutions in its perception, but its basic structure, the division into subjects and predicates, remains intact, such as it developed in the primordial process of the inscription of the embodied errors that, according to Nietzsche, informed and determined its structure. Everything must be thought or written in language, they say, but the language itself was written by the embodied errors once and for all. And in fact, it seems that one might draw the conclusion that the original, and for long periods also the primary, instinct-based function of thinking, from which everything else only later developed, is contained in the mediation between the use of language, within which the embodied errors occur spontaneously, and the extremely complex and almost permanent coordinative deceptive effort that the maintenance of at least some of the embodied errors, such as the ego and the stabilization of the world in being, require of the brain. The individual thought here acts as a kind of ignition switch or as an unconscious instinctive impulse, while language is a kind of microchip on which the basic program containing the matrix is written. But let us return now to the question of Nietzsche's psychological knowledge. I hope, that at least on the basis of this very brief exposition, very abstract exposition, which has focused on the notion of embodied error once again, we can see that the psychological aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy is based on quite clear and consistent methods. We have stumbled upon at least two. The first can be briefly described as the psychological absorption of evolutionary theory, and its wider significance in Nietzsche is evidenced by the fact that both perspectivism and the famous notion of the will to power derive from it in the broadest sense. The second method can be described as a systematic questioning and tracing of the root of the substantial representation, which has its origin, as Nietzsche wrote, in language, and not in the being outside us. However, the main effort of Nietzsche's ontopsychology, if I may call it so, is contained in the coordination of the two methods, in the synthesis of these two methods, which results, among other things, in the concept of the embodied error. And let us bear in mind that on this occasion we had to leave aside Nietzsche's most famous method, genealogy, which needs to be accompanied by a measure of regret, because it is precisely genealogy that opens up the terrain on which Freud and Nietzsche came really close. Just think of the central importance of guilt or bad conscience in the ontogenesis of the psyche and civilization in both authors, of the profound affinity between the ascetic ideal and the law of the superego. In general, of all that is encompassed by the key notion of internalization, of cruelty, that Nietzsche and Freud actually share. All in all, there is too much method at work within Nietzsche's psychology to need to resort to monstrous intuition. In its own way, another observation points to this. It is well known that Freud thought that modern philosophy, with the exception of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, was a stronghold of doctrinary opponents of the discovery of the unconscious, obviously because of its commitment to the notion of self-consciousness. Nietzsche, one would believe, shared this view, but in fact, at least one of his diagnoses was almost the opposite. In Beyond Good and Evil, he wrote that modern philosophy, from Kant onwards, was marked by murderous tendencies towards the notion of the soul. Nietzsche seems to have been much more psychoanalytical than Freud in this diagnosis, for it is clear that this slow incantation and carrying out of the murder of the soul had to take place under the facade of concepts that were supposed to at least partially re-establish the soul. Be that as it may, the process of the soul's murder began long ago, according to Nietzsche, and gathered together from very different wind directions. Bošković's dismantling of atomism, Kant's transcendental subjectivity, Hegel's dissolution of being in becoming and his grounding of self-consciousness in the other, modern scientific discoveries, evolutionism, Schopenhauer's irrationality of the will. In all of the above, this murderous thirst is already present and rising. It should not surprise us, therefore, that Nietzsche conceived of his own psychology, characterized by restless dismantling of the primacy of consciousness, as the moment of a final acceleration of a process already set in motion, rather than as a site of breakthrough discovery. We cannot fail to notice that the key pages of Beyond Good and Evil are pervaded by a spirit of lightness such as only an awareness of necessary unfolding can produce. A release of tension of the uncharted forces which, as Nietzsche describes, have been forced to work for centuries in utmost silence under the yoke of the discourses of their opposites, and which are now, in Nietzsche's work, at least attaining to their proper expressions in full swing. Nowhere else is this joyful impulse so strongly present as precisely within the lines that announce the collapse of one last form of atomism, namely the atomism of the soul. It is interesting to me, and I will conclude with this observation, that somewhere in the vicinity of the place where Freud began to devise his groundbreaking scientific discovery, Nietzsche on his sailing boat was merely taking notes of the devastating effects of the southern wind. Thank you.
Thank you, Aleš. That was great. I have a quick question, and then we'll move on. As you were speaking there, you mentioned Nietzsche and the unconscious, and you mentioned thinking, and then a bit later language. And I had this sort of Freudian moment, thinking in the unconscious, and thinking back to some of the themes in the conference so far. Tede was talking about some of these formulas of psychoanalysis. I guess one of them is the dream work doesn't think, the unconscious doesn't really have this kind of thinking element to it. So we've got the Nietzschean unconscious as one thing, and then the Freudian as something very, very different. And then going to another thing, we've got this kind of problem, we've got a double meaning, basically. We've got two unconsciouses, but a long difference, a long gap between them. And I think someone said yesterday, it might have been you actually, that in a sense, it's a shame that Freud called it the unconscious and didn't have a sort of neologism that would separate it from the tradition a little bit more. Thinking about the general theme of the concept, philosophy and psychoanalysis sort of interacting, I guess my question is there just too much of a difference between these two unconsciouses for there to be an interaction beyond looking at similar themes like guilt and this kind of thing? Or can we get a philosophy of psychoanalysis?
It's a very good and brilliant and difficult question, I would say, but because the entire conference is in a way, I would say, focused on this. Yes, but of course, I think that these are two very different types of unconscious. I wanted to also to stress this. And the question is obviously, I mean, can we indeed talk about the unconscious in Nietzsche? Because I think that in general, my position here was basically defensive in a certain sense, because I do believe, and I've been among Freudians for a rather long period, that what they think is that they suspect, okay, there is substance. When you speak about Nietzsche's unconscious, there is substance, there are instincts, there are cruelty drives, Triebe, Nachtriebe, and so on. But what Nietzsche lacks is form, or the concept. And I don't believe that. I think that what Nietzsche has is precisely, he has a concept of the unconscious in the form of the concept of embodied error. And I think it's a good concept of unconscious, even the very formal way, because it implies this kind of a full success of a self-deceptive endeavor. It is a concept which hides something inside. And this kind of basically forced me, because I wanted to stick with this, maybe I'm becoming annoying because every time I have a lecture here in this circle, I always speak on the embodied errors. But I mean, I believe that this is the central concept in the abstract sense of Nietzsche's psychology. Obviously, then there is the whole story with the genealogy of morality, but I wanted to stick here. And yes, I think that in this sense, this concept, there is this difference that the instincts, I would say so, maybe not that there is thinking within the unconsciousness, but that the unconscious instincts pervade also thinking. This it would be basically my first answer. So.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the paper. So our last speaker today is, I've probably slightly mispronounced everyone's name so far, so just in keeping with that, our last speaker is Adam Potes, senior lecturer in philosophy at Newcastle University, whose research interests are Maurice Blanchot, Georges Bataille, aesthetics, sound studies, and the philosophy of music.
Thank you, Stephen. So I'm going to stand. Can you hear is that picking up okay if I stand? No? Okay, get a roaming mic. I wander too much when I talk, so I'll just sit, Lorenzo. It's no problem. I can do this. Okay. Oh, wow. That was too loud. Okay, so the title of my paper today is Poetry, Hope, and the Primal Scene. And the aim of the paper is twofold. So firstly, I'm going to suggest that hope is a key aspect of Blanchot's thinking. So I'm going to be looking at Maurice Blanchot in the late 60s, particularly as he's writing the essays that comprise The Infinite Conversation. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to argue that hope is sort of essential to Blanchot's project during this period, a project best understood as a pursuit for the outside. Secondly, I'm going to frame his work, I'm going to frame this talk by creating some potential inroads into psychoanalysis The link to psychoanalysis implied in the paper is going to be through Blanchot's version of the primal scene. This actually comes later in a text called The Writing of the Disaster, but I'll be connecting this to the infinite conversation. There's more direct ways into thinking about Blanchot and psychoanalysis. He writes a paper called The Speech of Analysis in the Infinite Conversation, where he's talking about Freud and Lacan. There's a book in 2019 published by Joseph Kuzma called Maurice Blanchot and Psychoanalysis, and this has a real detailed look at these intersections. I'm not going to focus on these things for a couple of reasons. The first is I don't work on psychoanalysis, and I'm not going to pretend I do, so especially in front of this crowd, so I'm going to stay in a safe place. But more seriously, I'm going to focus on the primal scene, because it tells us some very important things about Blanchot's work. The primal scene, for instance, is illustrative of Blanchot, what Blanchot means by the outside, and therefore represents what Kuzma thinks Blanchot values in psychoanalysis, which is this emphasis on otherness. And it also helps us understand the strange temporality infused in Blanchot's notion of hopes and his theory of language. This scene is also comparable and has some subtle differences to some scenes in the work of Yves Bonfoy. So Bonfoy was a French poet and essayist, and in a collection called The Improbable, he writes an essay where he connects poetry and hope. And this is what Blanchot's responding to in an essay called The Great Refusal in the Infinite Conversation. So these are the things I'm going to be circling today. So no questions on Lacan's seminars, please, because I can't answer them. So I'm going to start by saying something about hope and how we can understand hope philosophically. If we're going to take hope seriously philosophically, we need to disentangle it from any kind of optimism. This is how Gabriel Marcel and Terry Eagleton think about hope in their own respective works. They argue that while optimism is like a quirk of temperament, not born out of anything deep, but more like a conservative belief in the progress and logic of the world, hope, by contrast, is born out of despair, and therefore is a deep and intimate part of oneself. As Marcel explains, quote, "There can strictly speaking be no hope except when the temptation to despair exists," end quote. Which leads him to conclude, quote, "Hope is the act by which this temptation is actively or victoriously overcome." That is to say, hope is like a strenuous commitment, a strength of character even, an emotional disposition maintained by oneself when the present has become intolerable. Of course, not all hope is a response to tragedy. There are instances of hope that are trivial, but Marcel is interested in these profound instances of hope. This kind of hope is not dependent on the probability of an outcome, and is retained sometimes despite the unlikeliness, even impossibility of the outcome. This kind of hope acts like a defiant non-acceptance of the tragedy of the present that keeps us open to the future as a site of possibility. Now, it's this kind of hope that plays out in the work of Bonfoy and Blanchot. This means that when I'm referring to hope in their work, I'm not referring to optimism. Their accounts of hope are responding to a loss of sorts, and we could even think of this perhaps as a lack. And where in Bonfoy hope is needed to counteract the pessimism of the modern age, in Blanchot this hope helps him think politically. And both of their hopes are not easily reducible to a particular end. In fact, the end or goal of their hopes is complicated quite radically. And this is where their difference lies, between the possibility and impossibility of achieving what they hope for, with only Blanchot leading towards the language of the latter. So I'm going to say something now about Bonfoy's notion of hope, and that'll lead me to Blanchot's account of the primal scene and into his notion of hope. So Bonfoy's account of hope and his desire to reclaim hope within poetry is underpinned by an implicit Nietzschean version of history. In an essay called Poetry and Photography, he talks about how, quote, "the project of submitting the knowledge of the world and existence to reason was also a project of dismantling the myths that had built, explained, and justified the world," end quote. There was a hope in art before this, particularly in poetry. And here Bonfoy talks about a kind of vaguely established pre-modern poetry, where poetry provided hope by way of offering sanctuary from the imperfections and horrors of finite existence through the protected place of words that were ultimately given a divine guarantee. But when this religious and myth-based world shatters, reality and life for Bonfoy are suspended over an abyss with a sense of vertigo and anxiety. Now, the great art of that age, of what Bonfoy thinks of as the modern age, starts to express this. It introduces disquiet. Stéphane Mallarmé's work is emblematic of this pessimism. At least this is how Bonfoy reads Mallarmé. The absence which Mallarmé's work circles and the chance and contingency it plays with is an argument for the non-essentiality of being. For Bonfoy, to identify absence at the heart of language is to admit, as Mallarmé had to, that, quote, we are but vain forms of matter, that, in fact, we are not, end quote. But it's not just poetry that interests Bonfoy. He focuses on photography, particularly Louis Daguerre in the invention of the daguerreotype. This first form of photography brought something into the frame that previous imagery tried to resist, namely chance. Bonfoy describes how no matter how contrived and posed the image captured by the daguerreotype, there is always something that cannot be controlled. For Bonfoy, then, the daguerreotype captured what was hitherto outside of the frame. That is, quote, the realm of perpetual change, end quote. And this connects to emptiness in his work. Quote, to see the element of chance in the image, he cannot but register emptiness in himself, end quote. Now, this is not, as Bonfoy goes on to explain, akin to, quote, the emptiness of the night, the positive full sense of the mystical experience in which the nada is in excess of being, but the fact that things of his days are now bereft of meaning and have become a cupboard whose drawers don't open, a pure enigma, the inwardly collapsed outside of the inside of here. So in the somewhat shared history of poetry and photography in Bonfoy, you see the sense of kind of innovation and newness which characterizes modernism, but also this kind of real uncertainty that emerges that could have devastating results. But things are not entirely hopeless. While this uncertainty can lead to pessimism, there's also an opportunity for hope, according to Bonfoy. So Bonfoy pleads, quote, let us not abandon the blank and empty horizon. Let us hold our ground, for it is true that already a change is taking place, end quote. And he continues, quote, the mournful star of existence, the elementary Janus, turning slowly, but at this instant, on itself reveals its other phase. A possibility appears on the wreck of all possibilities. Now, the possibility that appears on the wreck of all possibilities is what Bonfoy refers to as presence. Alexander Dickau explains presence as, quote, precisely what is beyond or outside of conceptual categories, the unconceptualizable experience of the being there of things in the here and now, end quote. So in this sense, it is entangled with chance and even emptiness. If chance is found in things like, to use Bonfoy's example, the surface of a stone with its cracks that cannot be deciphered, its colors for no apparent reason, then as well as having the potential to empty being of certainty and essentiality, it also has the potential to alert us to the here and now, to the in itself that is presence. So there's something like an oscillation in chance in Bonfoy's work, to see in those chance moments either emptiness, absence, death, or presence, a rootedness, a foundation, seems to amount to an existential decision. Now, this decision is at the heart of Bonfoy's retelling of Guy de Maupassant's story, The Night, a Nightmare, published in 1887. And this story is at the heart of his essay called Poetry and Photography. It's a great story by Maupassant. It's a terrifying one. Of this protagonist wandering around the illuminated Parisian streets, freshly illuminated as they've just introduced electricity for public lighting, only to find himself in the night where the city becomes increasingly desolate and everything shrouded in this kind of absolute darkness. And the protagonist calls out, but nobody answers. And Bonfoy reads the protagonist as someone gripped by a particular agitation, which he describes as of the mind writhing in horror at the catastrophic loss of its bearing. Now, the story ends with Maupassant's protagonist down by the River Seine, and he's down there looking for some kind of signs of life, some kind of presence of something. And he asks, was the river still flowing? But he can't find it, so he wades out into the river and seemingly meets his own death. Now, Bonfoy thinks the meaning and essence of this story is captured in these final scenes. And it also encapsulates this dynamic of chance, emptiness, presence, hope, or the absence of hope that I've just been circling. Maupassant's protagonist was unable to find any kind of meaning, any kind of presence in the depths of the night. And this is the fate that awaits any of us who cannot, as Bonfoy suggests, see meaning and life in our finitude. But we, as readers, don't have to come to the same conclusion as Maupassant's protagonist, Bonfoy tells us. And this is where we face a choice. To see in chance not emptiness, but some kind of vestige of being. To see something, to see a world, to see a here and now, and to believe others share this world. Put simply, to realize there is not nothing, and we are not alone. And this, for Bonfoy, is the basis of a different kind of hope. One that a different kind of poetry, different from this pre-modern poetry and the pessimism of someone like Mallarmé embodies. This kind of poetry sees presence as something like our true calling and pursues it in an affirmative way. This means that poetry must contend with what Bonfoy calls world in image, our conceptual understanding of the world that is schematic and ultimately reductive. Language, as we typically use it, does not capture presence. Instead, it necessarily neutralizes what is singular into, quote, a grand image shared by all, end quote. In this sense, with conceptual language, we lose something fundamental about reality in the world. Poetry, modern poetry as Bonfoy understands it, is thus, quote, the memory of a reality not yet undone by the work of concepts, end quote. It is an art attentive to what chance reveals and what presence affirms. In Mallarmé, again, this is how Bonfoy reads him, there's a pessimistic version of this, but he looks at someone like Charles Baudelaire and sees a kind of affirmation of this pursuit. And I don't have time to get into how he reads Baudelaire. I'm not a big reader of Baudelaire either. But he's kind of a placeholder in the essay where he sees him as an exemplar of a poet who sees presence as some kind of foundation of meaning and holds on to this as a desire to be in the world. Now, of course, there's a tension in this, as poetry is the art of language. It therefore resides in, quote, the constraints of conceptual articulation, end quote. Bonfoy openly embraces this paradox as the heart of the poetic impulse and the very need for hope. The poet is trapped on an inevitably circular path where they use language to try and make presence felt, while knowing, but also sometimes forgetting, all too well that presence is always what language cannot grasp. This is why Bonfoy describes poetry as dual. It is both a head-on attempt, a head-on attempt to reach presence, but also an inevitable, incessant falling back down that illuminates the human condition and allows men and women here in the world to share reflections emanating from their disappointed waiting, end quote. Now, this reference to disappointment should not be read entirely negatively too. It is not a fatal disappointment of Maupassant's protagonist. For Bonfoy, poetry might be unable to fully reveal presence directly, but the poet nevertheless hopes to, and this hope drives the pursuit. And through the acknowledgement of this conceptual alienation, through a sort of negative theology, Bonfoy does think we can eventually arrive, indirectly at least, at something like presence. And this is where his work pivots to possibility and something like an ontological possibility. So underneath Bonfoy's work, then, is a belief in something like a more authentic reality, an ontological wholeness. And this experience of reality is not entirely, this experience of reality is the only basis of any kind of meaning. any kind of real meaning in his work, and it gives us hope, and this modern poetry embodies this hope. Now, this version of reality is not entirely speculative. Bonfoy offers several examples of these supposed encounters of being, where we apparently see being or encounter being in its wholeness. And what's most interesting about these examples are the similarities and differences to what Blanchot presents in his version of the primal scene. The differences in particular get us to the core of what's at stake in Blanchot's version of hope. In an essay called Georges Poulet in Poetry, Bonfoy points to, quote, certain moments of childhood, the age at which the concept is only beginning to establish itself in the useful mind, where sounds disturb us, not because of their signification, but on the contrary, because of their absence of meaning, such as the noise of a boulder rolling down the ravine, after which there is a silence, or the mysteriously repetitive blows of the hammer banging in the distance, end quote. And Bonfoy thinks we have memories like traces of these experiences of presence, and he thinks there's hope in these memories. Quote, we are still able to perceive in the utterance of a phoneme this same in itselfness of the sonorous event that made of those noises from back then an appeal beyond the situations and present existence. In other words, an enigma, but one with an obscure hope in it, end quote. And again, the hope here pivots on a moment of decision, quote, from this aptitude for listening will ensue the possibility of a decision which will be, if we make it, the most important in our life, as it in fact was for humanity itself, beginning with the very morning after the invention of language, end quote. So the job of the poet then for Bonfoy is to somehow infiltrate world and image with this deeper meaning, with this experience of the world, and thereby kind of mapping a return to this experience of presence. Now, Blanchot's account of the primal scene, or what he calls the primal scene, offers quite a different opening, and it seems to occlude this sort of return. So this scene occurs in two places, but I'm going to do the version from the writing of the disaster. And it appears under a fragment called the primal scene. So Blanchot describes a child, aged 7 to 8, looking through a window pane at the garden, the wintry trees, the walls of a house. The child seems to grow weary and tired in this moment, and as he does, he looks up at quote, the ordinary sky, with its clouds, the gray light, the dull day without depth, end quote. And as he looks, the sky suddenly opens, exposing itself as, quote, absolutely black, absolutely empty, revealing as though through a broken window pane an absence such that everything has always forever been lost in it, so much so that affirmed and dissipated within it is the dizzying knowledge that nothing is what there is, and to begin with, nothing beyond, end quote. So interestingly, both Bonfoy and Blanchot are describing moments in childhood where the full grip of conceptual delimitations have not taken hold. In other words, both are describing something like inaugural moments in life that will later shape our relationship to the world. For Bonfoy, these moments leave traces of an echo of being deep within us and a call to return. For Blanchot, something else is happening. So in his book, Maurice Blanchot and Psychoanalysis, Kuzma spends a lot of time thinking about Blanchot's versions of the primal scene. And there are, in fact, two versions of this. So he first publishes as a short text for an edited collection for Philippe Lecoux-Labat in 1976. And then a second version appears in 1980 in the writing of The Disaster. And in the second version, primal scene is placed in quotation marks with a question mark at the end, so kind of primal scene. Now, this clearly introduces a level of uncertainty not there in the original, and Kuzma takes it as Blanchot's way of, quote, complicating the assumption that there exists something like a primal event whose recovery and translation might become possible within the analytic situation, end quote. But it also tells us something important about Blanchot's views on language and the limits of conceptual language and the role poetry plays within this space. Now, while the passage of the primal scene has been acknowledged by a number of commentators, the meaning tends to differ. And one commentator, Blanchot's biographer, Christophe Bidon, emphasizes the personal dimension of the scene, positioning Blanchot as the child. In other words, he takes it as something like an inaugural event that shapes the trajectory of Blanchot's thinking. But given the nature of the outside that's revealed in this scene, this framing is deliberately deceptive. Bidon here is trying to articulate a fundamental insufficiency that Blanchot contends with in all of his thinking. This primal scene is not a master key that unlocks his thinking. In this scene, Blanchot is exposed to what we might think of as the groundlessness of being, to an experience that is primal only to the extent it disrupts any notion of foundation or first moments. What he experiences in this moment is thus not presence or the real as presence, but as Paul Hegarty explains in his own reading of this scene, quote, the real that cannot be present, end quote. To be shaken by this kind of experience, then, means that any kind of return offered by writing can never be a path to presence. If writing seeks a return to the preconceptual moment, it will only ever return to this abyssal opening and to the real that can never be present, end quote. Now, this plays out in Blanchot's theory of language, where he has his own version of Bonfoy's world and image. In early essays like Literature and the Right to Death, for instance, he describes the act of naming as a foundational moment of being. One can even say that for Blanchot, language is antecedent to the world. It is the name and the power involved in naming that gives us the world as a manifest reality. Like Bonfoy, for Blanchot, this act is disquieting, even if it is fundamentally determinative. Language is unable to capture the totality of existence as it misses the dimension of what we might think of in his work as singularity. While Blanchot, to a point, adheres to the constitutive power of death via negation, his focus is primarily on what is not used and what cannot be used by this dialectic. Blanchot looks at what is not assimilated, what cannot be assimilated via negation. And this often takes the form of death and absence and different names in the outside in his work. This is where Blanchot differs from Bonfoy too. In The Great Refusal, Blanchot suggests that Bonfoy misunderstands the disruptiveness of this absence. He describes how, quote, the force of the concept does not reside in refusing the negation that is proper to death, but on the contrary, in having introduced it into thought, so that through negation, every fixed form of thought should disappear and always become other than itself, end quote. Far from forgetting or safeguarding against death, then, the concept is in fact infused with it. So if the name gives us being, it also annihilates something in the process, which Thomas Wall beautifully puts in Radical Passivity. Language tears itself apart the moment it begins to speak, end quote. So this makes the possibility of arriving at anything like presence in writing, even through a negative theology, impossible. In The Great Refusal, Blanchot expresses this strange dynamics in terms of the immediate. There cannot, Blanchot argues, quote, be an immediate grasp of the immediate, end quote. The immediate, quote, excludes everything immediate. This means all direct relation, all mystical fusion, and all sensible contact, just as it excludes itself, renounces its own immediacy, each time it must submit to the immediate of an intermediary in order to offer access, end quote. In other words, the general form of the concept can never capture the moment or the immediate. And it is not just the failure of this that matters for Blanchot. It is the way this absence disrupts the space of what is that is also significant. And just another quote from this passage. This amounts to saying the immediate, infinitely exceeding any present possibility by its very presence, is the infinite presence of what remains radically absent. A presence in its presence, always infinitely other. Presence of the other in its alterity, non-presence. Now there's a tragedy and sadness in Blanchot's idea, and this is really what earlier texts like The Space of Literature seem to embody. The absence and death that is supposedly latent within language means that the act of writing is close to death, potentially withdrawing us from the world into something like an essential solitude. This seems to preclude any notion of hope, and the impossibility of making present present is surely a recipe for disaster. But in the infinite conversation, references to solitude and death are replaced by references to plural voices, to the other, and to community. And impossibility resonates not only as the limit of the possible in language, but also as a different mode of speaking and writing other than that of power and comprehension. In other words, a political space starts to open up within this text. In The Great Refusal, Blanchot asks, quote, "Might there not exist relations, that is to say language, escaping the movement of force through which the world does not cease to accomplish itself? In this case, such relations, such a language would escape possibility." And it's at this point in the essay where Blanchot gives arguably his most detailed and affirmative account of impossibility. So possibility for Blanchot is not only an empty frame in which what may exist or happen passes through, but it's also tied to power. Quote, "It," so possibility, "is to be plus the power to be. Possibility establishes and founds reality. One is what one is only if one has the power to be it," end quote. This means that reality and constructions of reality are effects of power. And for Blanchot, power is largely an expression of control, domination, and even violence. By contrast, the thought of impossibility is not, as Blanchot explains, quote, "there in order to make thought capitulate, but in order to allow it to announce itself according to a measure other than that of power," end quote. And if this thought were entertained, Blanchot explains it would be, quote, "a kind of reserve in thought itself, a thought not allowing itself to be thought in the mode of appropriate comprehension," end quote. This means that the language of impossibility would be resistant to power, to comprehension, and therefore a language of contestation and difference. This is the language that Blanchot appeals to in The Great Refusal, when he asks, how can we discover the obscure? How can it be brought into the open? What would this experience of the obscure be, whereby the obscure would give itself in obscurity? These questions are instructive. They tell us about his resistance to any kind of framing that could potentially diminish the immediate by drawing it into the same. Obscurity demarcates the unknown, something unspeakable, some kind of limit, and Blanchot wants to somehow preserve this. This means that language must be used differently. It cannot be ontological, it cannot be dialectical, and it cannot be Bonfoy's language of presence. This other language is the language of impossibility. Language as an unworking of the conceptual function of language. What Blanchot is thinking about with the thought of the outside, then, is not something that can be consolidated in thought, but more like thought's breach. Impossibility is the way of describing the experience of this breach, as a kind of unsettling of space-time and an opening up to difference. Blanchot is, therefore, like Bonfoy, in the sense that he thinks certain types of poetry express something inexpressible, or try to express something inexpressible. And this thing is worth pursuing. But he's more radical in the sense that this outside, in its unfamiliarity, fundamentally contests the world as it is. So rather than establish some foundation of meaning, as presence does for Bonfoy, the thought of the outside endlessly contests notions of foundation and meaning. Oh, I'm conscious of time, but it might run over a little bit, but I'll try and speed up. So Blanchot's work during this time, then, can be understood as a hope for impossibility. This, in turn, is a hope for the outside. That being what allows us to think against the narrowness of violence, the narrowness and violence of possibility, This, I'm saying, is Blanchot's project, but a project that, much like Bataille's words in Inner Experience, would be the end of all projects, if the word project designates something with achievable ends and objectives, i.e. projects of power. This makes it a strange hope too. It is strange precisely because of its relation to impossibility. Hope is something that typically, even in its most complex moment, hinges on the possible. But impossibility, as I said a moment ago, is not the capitulation of thought. It is a mode of speaking that would announce itself according to a measure other than that of power. To hope for the impossible is to hope then for a different kind of language, the world and ultimately the other. And this is how we should read the extensive references to hope in The Great Refusal. In a lengthy, somewhat circular and almost dizzying account of hope, Blanchot lands on the following point, quote, "Hope bespeaks the possibility of what escapes the realm of the possible. At the limit, it is relation recaptured where relation is lost. Hoping not for the probable, which cannot be the measure of what there is to be hoped for, and hoping not for the fiction of the unreal. True hope, the unhoped for of all hope, is an affirmation of the improbable and a wait for what is." End quote. This is the hope to discover the obscure, the outside, which is an impossible thought. It is a thought beyond the mode of appropriate comprehension. To hope for this, then, is to will an interruption of thought, to aspire to a deferral of meaning, to hope to send language on a constant detour, where subjectivity, objectivity, and discourse are endlessly spun out. So a couple more points and then I'll finish. In his own analysis of the infinite conversation in his book Last Steps, Christopher Finsk rightly asks, "It is difficult to avoid asking how this time and space of saying between might be inhabited or traversed. In the strange conversation between two unnamed speakers that occur at the beginning of the infinite conversation, this experience is described in terms of fatigue and weariness. There's a sort of Beckettian logic to this state. Weariness in part characterizes one's state when one is forced into a prolonged period of waiting. In this case, the speakers are suspended in what would be an indefinite state of waiting as they try to bring the speech of the outside to the fore. However, this suspension and waiting can also be characterized by hope. This is because to hope for the outside is to be suspended in a state of waiting. For the outside can never be said to arrive. But to affirm this waiting, and to turn weariness into a kind of stubbornness that manifests as an act of refusal, is arguably Blanchot's own moment of decision. Somewhat akin to Bonfoy, this amounts to seeing the limits of language and the absence within it, but not capitulating. But rather than see presence in this gap, Blanchot sees alterity. And the decision here would be to regard this alterity as a call to a contestatory mode of thinking, to a language of difference, to a different mode of being in relation. So 2 more paragraphs and I'm done. I'll finish at 35. So if weariness and fatigue risk leading to despair and risk us withdrawing from the world, hope is what keeps and sustains us in the world and what gives us the drive to contest it. This is a mode of negatively being in the world, of refusing the mechanisms and institutions of power and possibility by aspiring to a different language and a way of thinking. And what is more, this mode of political contestation, driven by the thought of the outside, also draws Blanchot away from himself and out of his solitude and towards the other. This is what is at work when he starts to conflate his account of the outside with the other. In an essay called The Relation of the Third Kind, he positions the immeasurability of the outside in terms of the other. Quote, "I have in this relation with man, a relation with what is radically out of my reach. And this relation measures the very extent of the outside. This tells us that true exteriority is not that of objects, nor that of an indifferent nature or the immense universe. True strangeness, if it comes to me from man, comes to me from this other that man would be. He alone, then, is the eccentric. He alone escapes the circle of vision from which my perspective unfolds." End quote. So if the hope for impossibility is a hope for a different kind of relation with the world than the kind offered by ontology and dialectical time, we can also understand this as a hope to enter into a genuine relation with the other, a relation characterized by difference. The language of impossibility, this language that announces itself by a measure other than that of power, this language of dispersal on difference, is then the language most proper to the dimension of the other. If we, as Blanchot said about obscurity, look to retain the other as other. Poetic hope in Blanchot's work, then, is not just a refusal of presence by way of absence, nor simply an expression of the limitations of certain types of philosophy. It is also political. It is political in that it contests the language of possibility, which is always a language of power, and because it points to a potential relation with the other, that preserves otherness. This would be, as Kevin Hart suggests in his book, The Dark Gaze, quote, the hope of a communication of humanity at the limit of the possible, end quote. And this is how we can understand Blanchot's reference to a different kind of writing in the note that opens the infinite conversation. Quote, no longer the writing that has always been in the surface of speech or thought called idealist, but rather the writing that through its own slowly liberated force, the force of absent, seems to devote itself solely to itself as something that remains without identity, and little by little brings forth possibilities that are entirely other, an anonymous, distracted, deferred, and dispersed way of being in relation, end quote. This is Blanchot's strange project, a hope for the impossible, a hope for the outside, and a hope for a community that is always inevitably a community to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. That was great. I just have one very quick sort of technical question, really, and then we'll get on to the panel discussion, which I'm sure everyone's looking forward to. About the notion of the primal scene. I mean, in Freud, as soon as he said primal scene, again, my Freud sense goes off, and I'm thinking of the Wolfman case, and the thing that we get there is the primal scene is buried beneath repression and reworking and so many levels. It's totally inaccessible to the person. And I was wondering if there's a similar level of reworking in Blanchot's sort of childhood memories, or whether he thinks you do have direct access to this primal scene, and you can kind of, what you get from it in thinking about it, and how you get to it.
Yeah, I mean, he's not super autobiographical, really, apart from Death Sentence. So Bidon's reading of it being about his childhood, it's a strange kind of reading in some ways, but like I say, I think he's being kind of deliberately playful there, because I think really what you have in Blanchot is this constant unmooring. So this is why, you know, he's really interested in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Just as Eurydice is nearly drawing into the light and you look, it kind of vanishes, and this is always what happens in Blanchot's work. So the notion of the anything like the primal could never be recovered, and that's kind of the strength of the thought in it in some ways. It reveals the sort of impossibility of that in some ways. So that kind of answers.
Well, thanks again, Adam, and can we get the rest of the panel up now, please, and we'll move into some questions. Okay, let's take a question from Moritz first.
I have a question for Aleš. Thank you for the paper, that was brilliant. My question might resonate with, I think, a question Lorenzo asked last time, because it pertains to the embodied error. If I got you correctly, your conceptual move was to not only associate the embodied error with the ego, but also with the drive or the instinct. And I understand why you do that, because if you associate the embodied error exclusively with the ego, you end up with a quite Leibnizian concept of the unconscious, where every error is an error of the consciousness with respect to the infinite small perceptions. And this is, I guess, a more Deleuzian reading of both Leibniz and Nietzsche and so on, and in the end quite incompatible with not only Lacan but also Freud more directly. And so you try to then account for the embodied part of the error via the instinct. But in lack of a better concept for instinct or drive, you proposed that the instinctual level is itself a sort of egoical instinct, if I got you correctly, which is evolutionary perpetuated for the sake of the survival of the species. And I'm, in general, sympathetic to push this line because there is a possible convergence with the idea that the drive itself in Lacan is repeating the error, but that phantasmatically this missing of the object in the drive is directed towards the one, and thereby the error is itself repeatedly produced and gives rise to self-consciousness. Not only ontogenetically, but we do that all the time. And I think, in general, I'm very sympathetic to this, like, pushing Nietzsche towards Lacan rather than Deleuze. But I'm asking myself, or you, whether there isn't a limit at this point in terms of the conceptuality of the drive or the instinct in Nietzsche.
Thank you, very good question. I mean, here I mostly focused, I would say, on the way how instincts, in a way, affect the cognitive apparatus. So, I mean, there is, I would say, much richer aspect of Nietzsche's talks, of his conceptualization of instincts or drives elsewhere, more in the genealogical side. So, as I said before, my principal attempt was to show some sort of form, how the form of how, in a way, the Nietzsche's unconscious kind of intervenes within the conscious, and how it in a way is within and disappears alongside the consciousness itself. So. Then now, if this was a move from the previous session, I wouldn't say that. I think that ego is, in a way, some sort of a Nachtrieb or some sort of overdrive in Nietzsche. I think I also claimed that also on the last session. So it is, I mean, it is drive, it is this embodied error are drives. This appears in Nietzsche itself, and obviously also the ego is very much instinctively invested in Nietzsche. I think this is also maybe to some degree a certain divergence with Freud, that of course, there are always instances of oppression also in Nietzsche. But I think that, for instance, the story of the ascetic ideal shows that he always tries to present, he in a way, certain way, reads this in the opposite direction by showing how much are also these instances of for instance, of the ascetic ideal, how much it is invested with the libidinal various forces and engagements. Now, I wouldn't actually this, if I'm trying to push this in against Deleuze or against Lacan, what I really thought that was in a certain way a new aspect in comparison to the last lecture was that if we perceive this concept of embodied errors as drive, it's in a certain way, in a surprising way for what is usually assumed of Nietzsche, opens up the terrain or leaves at least the door open for some sort of conception of subjectivity. Because in general, I mean, the usual aspect of Nietzsche's drive model is basically, and it's interesting because also Heidegger kind of has this, in a certain way, joins this line of critique of Nietzsche, that basically he ascribes every activity that we do within subconscious instinct. So we have this kind of a humulcarious or some sort of inflation of various instincts and so on. So it's always some sort of multiplicity, subject as a multiplicity, the instincts as infinite number of of multiplicities. And then Heidegger, for instance, said that, Nietzsche is the ultimate philosopher of subjectivity, precisely because he simply kind of he does criticize the more egoistic part of subjectivity, but he basically just transposes the characteristic of subjectivity to the drive itself, and in a certain way just reinscribe that. I'm very skeptical about this, because I think that even Nietzsche himself said that this kind of a multiplicity of drives and so on, and this precisely is copying of this kind of a naive, egoistic subjectivity onto the drive, multitudes of the drives, in a way repeats the mistake that we usually perform with language by the substantiality, that we in a way endow everything in the substantiality. But on the other hand, if we look at this model of the embodied error, it allows for a very directly Cartesian subjectivity in a certain sense, because it has this moment of self-deception of the drive, and I would say that Nietzsche could at least say that subject used to be really, the individual really used to be a Cartesian subject, because he could always say, I was so well deceived that I do exist. And what seems to be the problem in Nietzsche is that this kind of this kind of capacity of being deceived is in a certain way disappearing.
Right, we'll have Holden next, then Lorenzo.
So thank you to all of you. I have questions for each of you, but I'll just ask one to Adam because it's freshest in my mind. So I'm not going to force you to talk about Lacan's seminars, but I am going to force you to talk about the speech of analysis in the infinite conversation, because I think that there is a point you make that has a subterranean relation to things both Alejandro and Tadej said yesterday, and I sort of want to push this commonality of the researchers here, yeah. So in the speech of analysis, there's a moment where Blanchot sandwiches between several quotations from Lacan a comment, which is something to the effect of, in Lacan's hands, psychoanalytic technique becomes a dialectic that fundamentally disjoins the participants. So although there is some sort of dialogue established, that there's always this infinite distancing from one another that's occurring in analysis. And one of the formulations that he quotes from Lacan and that he pulls from Lacan is precisely about this work of remembrance. In psychoanalytic amnesis, it is not the construction of reality, it's something like this. So I'm wondering to what extent on your reading that Blanchot actually can raise these psychoanalytic formulations to their utmost provisionality, in a sense. So they don't provide ready-made answers. They don't provide models by which the analysis can proceed in a straightforward or predetermined manner. And so in this way, Blanchot sort of takes these formulations and prevents them from being submitted or subordinated to the constructions of reality that would be instances of power for Blanchot.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I can answer, in terms of that point, in terms of what, whether he could raise psychoanalysis up. But I mean, my sense is, and this is kind of coming from the Kuzma in that essay, is that, what he values in psychoanalysis is this appreciation of otherness, which he seems to think is in Freud's work through the dialogue essentially between, the two people. But where he's skeptical of psychoanalysis is when it becomes this sort of institution, really, like another form of medical practice. And if it frames itself as this sort of master key to unlocking something. And I think he thinks Lacan's work kind of recovers psychoanalysis in some ways from the dangers of the institutions. So I mean, in some ways, what he values in psychoanalysis would cross over to what he values in literature and writing. Which, I mean, interesting in the infinite conversation is that I mean, Stephen asked in the first talk about this difference between speech and writing. In the Infinite Conversation, he just kind of collapses them. He talks about speech as a form of writing. He doesn't really work through that. He just kind of assumes it in some ways. So my sense would be, if this is kind of answering your question in some ways, yeah, something about literature, something about poetry conceived in its best form in the sense of what he thinks it could be doing in this radical way would be close to what he thinks the best part of psychoanalysis would be. Does that kind of answer? Yeah, okay.
I'll come to Lorenzo, then I'll come to you, if that's okay. Holden was very brave there, asking a question of his supervisor that he asked not to be asked about.
Well, thank you all three. Great papers. I'm actually continuing the conversation between Aleš and Moritz. And actually, Aleš, you told us in November, you insisted on the embodied error, and now you return to it. Please, next time, go on, because there's so much to be said there. And following on Moritz, I mean, the kind of Nietzsche you're presenting, I mean, is a new Nietzsche to me, and a very good Nietzsche. I'm really simplifying here. I'm Nietzsche that can be made to dialogue, if not with Freud, with Lacan. And as Moritz said, it's an anti-Deleuzian Nietzsche, to be really simplistic here. So the crucial, correct me if I'm wrong, but the crucial point here for me, and I guess for you, and I'm asking for a confirmation, would be to say, it's very easy to say that the embodied error refers to the ego and self-consciousness, right? I mean, we can all agree, and it's a quite kind of like mainstream Nietzsche, right? So the ego, self-consciousness, and everything else that follows, also morality, blah, 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 Christianity, and we go on, right? What you see there instead is an attempt at thinking the embodiment of error on the level, to simplify in a psychoanalytical sense, of the drive itself or the very functioning of the unconscious. And that's where I see, you know, either a Nietzschean Lacan or Lacanian Nietzsche, because I think something very similar, I mean, Moritz put it very well 5 minutes ago, is at work in Lacan, a certain error of counting is something that for Lacan is important, not only when we try to tackle the unconscious in a formal manner, but in loco, that is to say, ontogenetically, the emergence of the unconscious, which is to say in Lacanese, the logic of fantasy, is, closely paraphrasing Lacan, has to do with the fact that we count ourselves counting, so nous nous comptons, and then he says, ça compte, so it counts, so it, the unconscious counts, and when there is such logic of the unconscious, there is in parallel Spaltung and self-consciousness, right? You don't have unconscious and then self-conscious, or vice versa. Ontogenetically structure emerges together. But this is really close to what you're saying, if I got you right. That is to say, it counts is already too much. It miscounts. You see the 2 points? I mean, one is the fundamental, I would say, fundamental, from a Lacanian perspective, the idea that the error of counting, or the embodied error, which is embodied, drive, soma, psyche, soma, right? Not enough to say it pertains to the ego, the unconscious, but then the next step is to actually prevent the risk of, although via depersonalization, giving too much to that it, right? Giving too much emphasis. And if I got you right, you were saying the same thing about Nietzsche.
Yeah. I mean, I can just say that I'm very thankful for this observation, because I think it's kind of a really, first of all, you explained also a lot of things, how you can relate this to the Lacanian field, and I'm very happy to hear that it's relatable. But I believe that we are on the same track. That you actually, that we are really close here.
Hi, It's kind of a question for Henrik and maybe also slightly for Adam. It's about the fact that you were talking about ventriloquy and prompting, and makes me think about staging and theatre, and perhaps also touching on something Adam said. There's speech and there's writing, but there's also reading or vocalized writing, and I guess I don't know if it's really I don't know what my question is, but it's essentially like, can you relate the way that Kierkegaard's dealing with authorship, which, we could also say it's a kind of characters he's creating maybe through this through any kind of relation to staging, and maybe that staging I think of also as kind of a certain kind of temporality, and maybe the reason why this is maybe connected to what Adam was saying as well. This question, like, is presence in writing impossible? You could say yes and no, in that presence in writing can be staged, and this would be this moment where there's a contingency in writing, because there is this, the framing that the stage provides, where you have, the necessity of the prompt itself indicates that there's contingency, that there's a chance that what is written won't be said properly, or something like that. Well, it was just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. I think, there's a whole line of things that I'm not sure I've thought through enough, but so one thing occurs to me at least, that, for example, the whole idea about the relation between the spoken voice and sort of let's say the literary voice in Kierkegaard, I think there's a whole issue connected to, for example, the fact that Kierkegaard himself said many times that he himself has read the text aloud, or said it out loud several times, every time before he actually writes it down. And like many commentators have noted, that his style of writing, and he emphasizes this also himself, it is actually, even in the punctuation, and of course in the, let's say, rhetorical figures and the repetitions of certain phrases and so on, it is very much lending itself to the idea of being read aloud, actually, when you read the text. So for Kierkegaard himself, there's sort of like an intimate relation between speech and writing, in this sense that the writing is supposed to sort of, let's say, work through certain things that are meant to be vocalized also. And I think that this relation and his own emphasis on the reading out loud has sort of also meant that, to some commentators, this has meant that what goes on when you read Kierkegaard is in a way that you have to sort of internalize the thinking that has been written down, so that you can reproduce a certain kind of similarity to his own sort of, and this relates maybe to the question of presence and absence, so his own, let's say, original, authentic voice, when he imagining that how Kierkegaard said it out loud is really what we have to sort of, in a way, reproduce. And then we have the whole problem with Derrida's critique of this voice of presence, right? And so what I want to do with the idea of ventriloquism is, in a way, precisely to say that this is not how it's working in Kierkegaard, that this, what is produced in the writing, in the text, is at least as much a production of this leftover, the remainder of the I narration, that escapes for example, the pseudonymous authors themselves, and to a significant extent escapes Kierkegaard himself. So his own idea about reading out loud his text is, I don't know, sometimes even seems to me a little bit naive, and this emphasis on the what he calls inderlighed in Danish, the internal consideration and depth of thought and so on, can be overemphasized and I think it's precisely when you read the text that you can find all these kind of different instances of cross-references and lacks and confusions and contradictions and so on that literally contradict this idea of a certain original presence that can be reproduced. And I think that this is also what is going on in good ventriloquism on the stage, that in a way, of course, you have ventriloquists that are they have made the whole script in advance, and they know precisely when to say which sounds and how to make the puppet speak and so on. But in very good acts, there's very serious conceptual thinking, I think, about what is it actually that's speaking, which is not at all as clear as it might immediately appear in our. I would like to, even to show there's a British ventriloquist called Nina Conti who has an excellent act. She has a puppet called Monkey, who is in a way sort of speaking out, working through her clearly her sort of dark, a lot of vulgar sexual thoughts for this, and this is a very typical model, of course, for ventriloquist. But also what this monkey does is that it has very refined it also says, for example, I would much rather talk about Kant and Wittgenstein than I would sort of reproduce your dirty thoughts and so on. It just wants to get rid of her dark side. And she has particularly one act which I really like, and I have been writing about this in another place, where Monkey actually takes over her body and starts to speak through her mouth. So in the end of the act, she's speaking through her own mouth, but in Monkey's voice. And this, I think, that I'm trying to, but it's too much to reproduce here, but I'm trying to analyze that through a concept in Kierkegaard called reduplication, where the distance between the teacher and the taught is suddenly aufgehoben, so to say, in certain moments. But yeah, I don't know if it's, but Adam, it was also partly for you.
Yeah. I mean, not so much about. I probably don't have anything interesting to say about staging, but yeah, I mean, the sense of kind of absence and presence and the play of it, and where presence might be, but it's kind of, this is kind of central to Blanchot's thought. But I mean, in Literature and the Right to Death, he talks about two slopes of literature. On the one side, you've got this language that is about kind of naming and in the world, and then you've got this other side of language, this kind of shadowy realm that kind of breaks and ruptures through in some ways. So I think he's always kind of thinking about this dynamic in the work, and it's interesting in his work how much his writing changes. I mean, but after, I think I've got this right, but I think after The Infinite Conversation, that's the last time he's doing the kind of big essays, and he starts going into this real fragmentary mode of writing, like the writing of the disaster and the step not beyond. It's a really strange mode of writing that's not quite literature, it's not quite essay. So he's also kind of constantly working with what language is and what that mode of language is. It's why poetry and literature has quite a broad kind of reach in his work in some ways. So I don't know if that quite answers your question. But
Yes. Thank you all three first for excellent papers. I just wanted to make I don't know if I really have some comments on Henrik's paper. And of course I like a lot the notion of ventriloquism as somehow the essential spring of Kierkegaard's writing. And you laid out beautifully the complexity, the labyrinth of these different pseudonyms and quasi-authorships and delegating the authorship and a display of the voice redoubling itself. And I think, well, this is my comment, that this is where actually Kierkegaard started, I think, with the question of redoubling of the voice, because his dissertation was on the concept of irony with a constant reference to Socrates. And what is irony in a very elementary sense? It's ventriloquism. It's speaking with two voices at the same time. It's like saying what you are saying and saying also the opposite of what you are saying. It is what Kierkegaard was very fascinated with. Plus, on top of this, you have the very question of Socrates brings up the origin of philosophy, because the origin of philosophy is Plato sort of ventriloquizing Socrates. Because Plato says in the second letter, there isn't any writing by Plato and never will be, because there's only one author, is Socrates. So he's outsourcing the authorship. No, so my comment is only that the redoubling of the voice, the redoubling of the authorial voice, is perhaps the original experience, as it were, where Kierkegaard starts from. And the multiple pseudonyms and the very intricate way, very intricate logic, how he plays it out, is a sort of a more radical consequence of this origin.
Yeah, thank you. That's excellent. I mean, just a small reply in a sense, but I think it fits very well with. I mentioned that I sort of see three different periods of Kierkegaard's authorship, and the concept of irony falls in the first period, together with this very early, more youthful work, if you will, from the papers of One Still Living. In both cases, they're written in Kierkegaard's own name. Of course, his dissertation is written in his own name. And in both cases, I think you could make an analysis more in the direction of Kierkegaard struggling with certain questions that are becoming much more explicit later on. And it fits very well, I think, what you said about irony, that it's not explicitly there the way you are formulating it in Kierkegaard's work, but it is a very sort of scholarly exhibition of almost a Hegelian reading of Socrates and so on. And so what I want to do is to say that in this early work, there's an announcement of a voice that needs to be investigated, if you will, almost. And there's a letter he writes to one of his friends, also in 38, where he writes that I need a voice, and then he describes this voice in a multitude of different ways, that it has this and this and this and this characteristic, more or less contradictory to each other and so on. But he's really searching for a voice clearly and explicitly. And I would say that these, before 41, 42, this is what he's trying out. And then you get this, especially from 42 to 46, get this extremely productive period where he writes sort of like maybe the five main works of philosophy in Danish, extremely fast. And there he is very consciously experimenting. But still, I would claim that there's certain issues going on with the redoubling and the not known or some unconscious element or extimate voices and so on. And then in the last part, the third part, he turns religious in another sense than he had been before, and he himself sort of turns it around. For example, in his preface to Anticlimacus's work on the practice of Christianity, he says that in this book there's a demand of what it means to be Christian that is made explicit, and this demand must be heard, and I understand what has been expressed as addressed only to me. So Kierkegaard sees what is expressed in the formulation of what it means to be a Christian as addressed to him. So he is turning into more someone who is receiving a message rather than sort of experimenting with the voice and so on. But the redoubling always, I think, remains there. More or less explicit and more or less clear.
Right, we're going to end the questions there because we've started to eat into lunch in a bad way here. If anyone does have a question that they didn't get to ask, do feel free to ask it over lunchtime. And
thank you.
Yeah, the panel probably doesn't like that. I'd like to thank all of the presenters for their excellent papers and also for the questions and answers here. It's been a brilliant session, so thank you very much. What time are we starting again, Lorenzo? We're starting again at 3.